just buy that?
You know, I've had it for a while, and it's been in my car for a while too, and I've just never, I keep forgetting to bring it in. Thought my iPad could just kind of figure that out, but it has this internal limit to it. Are we kind of done talking about our sections? Can we kind of come together, all the whole class here, whole group of people? What was your section? Let's start. Who has the first section? I know it's probably you guys.
It's us.
You guys had.
You guys have 4?
4. Okay.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead and start us off then.
Do you want me to just give you facts, or do you want?
Facts and then some type of summary of them. So don't need to read all the facts, just things that you found were interesting, and particularly answering those questions. There's surprising things, and then how does it from those facts show science is sort of unique from the other areas of knowing so far?
Okay, so Leibniz was a scientist who his principle of sufficient reason, and he believed that anything that happens so for a definite reason, and that the universe was a vast interconnected system of relations.
Okay.
And then Newton, he explains it as the universe as being particles that move in empty space, and it is the way that they are arranged in the universe that gives its complex structure. And then if you were thinking about it as how is scientific knowing different from other areas of knowing, or actually, it's something surprising that you can just see is the different theories that had to be connected together to create the theories that we have today.
Okay. Yeah, that is an interesting, because in other sections, I think it was, at the very beginning, right on page 164, before it talked about the role of assumptions, and also that conflict even at the time between Newton and Leibniz about the theory and role of science. You had a section of does science remain the same throughout history? Is that yes or no? Is that motion correct? Does science has science remained?
No.
Science has remained
It's always changing.
It's
the
always
same throughout
changing,
history, and but is that not so? That very idea of science and history, does science necessitate staticness? Is that even in its definition that science must become a static thing?
Certain principles, maybe.
Certain principles might be so
Like the
well
theory of-
established
I don't know, like relativity.
that the assumption of them, the assumption of their development is required in order for you to move
Law of gravity, yeah.
forward, because you first established through observation or experimentation this paradigm. So we're talking about paradigms, but those paradigms do shift depending on how the theories best explain the way things are and our understandings of
We
them.
were talking about theories shifting when we were talking about earlier last week on Albert Einstein's, it was the photoelectric paradigm shift.
Mhm.
He was talking about how particles could be, or how light could be either a particle or a wave.
Right.
And he found in 1903 that light must be both a particle and a wave to fit all the observed facts.
Right, so you have these observed facts, and instead of trying to fit those facts into what you had already known about particles and waves and light in general from the past, from previous experiments, you have to sort of develop a new way of thinking about those. And I think further observations have confirmed that I guess hypothesis, but also conclusion. The idea that you set out new experiments, especially with the photoelectron and that sort of new paradigm of how light exists. So light can actually exist in this electrical way, which is the basis of electron microscopes. By the way, I didn't tell you about the practical application of that duality, that particle duality. You know what? It's a very simple thing that allows, because of our understanding of the particle wave duality of light, your cell phone camera can work. It was on that website that had the animation, but something interesting to think about as well, that the mechanisms that normally are created mechanically on the camera that requires the full lens and the optics and everything can actually be condensed down because we understand how duality works. And so we often think of these like crazy quantum theories as being like, well, what's the personal application of this? I mean, they do the same thing with theory of relativity. GPS, I mean, your cell phone, again, wouldn't work. Apple Maps or Google Maps would never work without the understanding that space and time are relative. And it seems to take that thing that's so academically broad and distant into literally what Sagan said, how much we rely on this technology, and yet what about the general population do we observe regarding their education of it? I mean, how many of you guys know people who, I don't know, you can just say, obviously all of us know people that don't know much about things, or don't care to know how the world works, people who don't question things. It's a particularly frustrating thing sometimes to interact with people who are not questioning. I think naturally we are all questioning beings, at least in the IB. Something somewhere suppresses that, and we're not sure we can talk about that, I guess. That might be another question for the next following week. Well, can you describe real quick the difference between the principle of sufficient reason and Newton's view? Because you did mention those two things. I'm just wondering if there's something simple I can give them for their notes.
Okay.
Go ahead. Take a look at it. Sense of the world. The Newtonian view.
I guess Leibniz is saying that it can't be something, space can't be something, while Newton's saying it exists independently.
Perfect. I think it has to do with that sort of dense understanding of space. So dense meaning it's a complicated philosophical jumble of science, metaphysics, religion, and I guess their own sort of viewpoints, or whatever, there may be cultural viewpoints, but they focus on this idea of space. Space is, according to Newton, space itself is a thing. It's a thing in itself, as opposed to Leibniz, which maintains that space is sort of an attribute. So it'd be like, is part of you, Sean, is part of your attribute that you take up space, or that is it that it's part of your essence that you take up space, meaning it's like something that you have, like you are space, or that you take up space? So it's a difference in like the relationship aspect of it, or so is space something? Is space something, or is it merely a description of something? Is it the difference between dog and nice? Do you know what I mean? And so this is the question that beheld them, but it was part of space is obviously some important aspect, it's a whole dimension of the universe. So it really impacted everything about it. So the principle of sufficient reason, which is that Leibniz's position, correct? Is that you have everything sort of relational to each other, as opposed to Newton, which believed everything had a concrete, everything was in itself fundamental, and these particles had existed with these properties since the dawn of time. Newton kind of lost out on a lot of these areas, especially with the paradigm shifts going on, because it turned out that things that were, Leibniz wasn't correct either. There was a lot of shift that went on to that. But once you have Einstein in the mix, proving relativity, relational aspects of space is the fundamental thing now that we observe. And you can actually see space if you can kind of look at it like planes. Since the Big Bang, the theory is that not only are things expanding away from each other, we're actually seeing that space is getting bigger. Like it's the plane itself is stretching like a balloon. Think about like a big balloon that's just sort of stretching out. That's sort of what entire space-time is doing at the same time. So this is part of a complex view of relativity, that these things change and that we experience those things differently depending on how fast we're moving, how much gravitational pull is on us, and that light is a constant.
Are you explaining it with elastic qualities, like the universe, to the point where it'll expand so much that it condenses all again?
That is one theory of how the universe, and is that proven? The idea of condensing universe, that it's this constant cyclical elasticity. That's something to look into. I knew Hawking actually had a theory. We mentioned his. We did it linguistically, where we looked through all of how Stephen Hawking went through his process of being wrong, and put them in a specific order, like, how do these thoughts relate to each other, and which is the correct order. We all kind of figured out what the order was, and we did a really good job of that. But it was actually about his idea of, can we potentially be instead of thinking we're expanding, we are actually we're actually contracting and that we're experiencing the world or the universe in this sort of backwardsy way. Like, is it possible to do that? Of course, it was disproven, and so he knew it as such and was writing it down as such. But that is one such view of the universe, that it could be contracting. But you're saying it's disproven? I have to look into it. So, but you're pretty convinced on that.
It's a sine graph.
Is it a sine graph? Sinusoidal kind of
Yeah.
curve that goes up and down. Yep, could be. All right, cool. What else? Is that all that was in your section?
It talks about Thomas Kuhn.
Okay.
His was just the theory of the way science can change through evolutionary shifts.
Through evolutionary shifts from a biological standpoint, like a biological evolution.
I don't have that in my notes. It just
Okay.
says just from any standpoint. And then there's the social aspect of the paradigm shift, as you can see with Charles Darwin, Origin of Species,
Mhm.
how it created people. It changed their whole way of thinking, and then it made some people completely refute him and how they made fun of him
Yeah.
for cartoons.
Oh, right. So with Kuhn, he's talking about paradigm shifts. So Thomas Kuhn is a theoretician, he's a scientist who looked at science and scientific history through the lens of paradigm shift, which is kind of what we're doing too. I'm just assuming that that's a model that is interesting to look at. It might not necessarily be perfectly explanatory, but paradigm shifts are important to the idea of science, and we've talked about it. And he uses the example of Darwinian evolution. So when Darwin hits the scene and describes this new mechanism by which diversity of species can exist independently of explanations from the past, that is, i.e. design, the idea that each individual, sort of the assumption of science before that each individual animal and plant was specifically designed for the environment that it currently is in. But with new developments from all the way back from Linnaeus to the present day at the time with Darwin, there was this idea that there was gene drift. There are changes in environments that caused, as a result, changes in an animal species and population. Natural selection, but not just that. But gene drift is it's correlated, but not caused by natural selection. They're similar. Gene drift is also about random mutations, so there's that element as well involved. But there are external pressures in society. These are just basically, I'm just summarizing what evolution is, but the point of it is that biology has been forever changed as a result of that new system. No longer you need the assumption that design is required for each individual species there. Now, does that raise other issues, or is there still an ongoing conversation? I think you can make that argument that there is some type of conversation, but it's going to have a very different view than it was at the time of Darwin. Before Darwin, you could have a certain view that is probably obsolete at this time, I think, from a scientific standpoint.
The world is flat after a certain paradigm shift.
Yeah, and that
Just now it doesn't seem.
Yeah, you can liken it to that. I think that's a bit subversive in the sense that to religious knowing it a little bit, because I guess because of the severity of it. The idea that the Earth is flat versus evolutionary, every evolutionary theory. I'm trying to think how I'd explain it. The Earth is flat. We have now perfect explanatory power, I think, to disregard that claim that the Earth is flat. I think that there's still ongoing questions about the completeness of evolution that can be done within an evolutionary system. So it's like the debate within an evolutionary paradigm about the focus of evolution. But I think you're right in the sense that you can't question evolution in the same way that people would like to question it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's not something that can be done in the same way any longer. It can't be done. Meaning at the time of Darwin, when they're satirizing him, making fun of his cartoons, there was the position that every species was perfectly designed for the current environment that you see it in today. That is demonstrably incorrect. So whatever system or belief is in existence about the origins of species, that can't be the claim. Does that make sense?
They talked about that too in the debate, right? When they're saying that they measured the There's like the amount of nothingness in the universe.
And it has-
it's like the worst possible universe that we could ever live in.
That was, that is actually, and that's not quite evolutionary, so.
Yeah, but I'm just saying we're
it's,
talking about how we shouldn't be able to live in this universe, but yet we do, and they're saying how natural selection has allowed us to live.
yeah, and that's an interesting meta-analysis of worldview, because I think we'll get into the anthropic principle next week, or on Wednesday, so that's something that we'll kind of get ahead of ourselves, but the idea is, do we have sufficient knowledge to conclude whether or not this is this ability of sentience and intelligence, is this a wonderful expression of design that was meant to be, that the whole universe has been established for this very thing that we're doing right now, which is knowing the universe and discussing knowledge? Or is it that, like the scientists that were debating the motion, not proponents of the motion, were that the universe is in fact the worst of all worlds, the worst of all places, very inhospitable, and as a result we have sort of this serendipity of intelligence, that we are in fact not, we are complex to ourselves, but the knowing that we have is not necessarily, doesn't have any more grand design than our molecules that make us up. So there is a fundamental, that's where you might have heard them sort of talking past each other, which is always how this language breaks down, in my opinion, between the two sides. So, yeah, and that's an interesting, I mean, the paradigm shift, I think there's a lot of credence to the theory of paradigm shift as a way of looking at science. That you look at it from these big sort of changes that go on in science. And it actually, it reflects a lot of the evolutionary theories that have existed throughout time. So for instance, during the time of Darwin, do you guys are familiar with Lamarck? Lamarckian evolutionary systems? So he's another example, not from the evolutionary perspective of an obsolete evolutionary theory. In fact, a lot of Darwin's theories turn out not to be true as well. But the paradigm has still retained its explanatory power, so it maintains a strong theoretical basis, and that we assume it to be the way the world works because we can observe it. The Lamarckian view is that if you can, that species through adaptation in environments and through pressures can actually retain its changes as a individual creature, as an individual species, or not species, individual specimen. Specimen was like the singular version. Specimen can actually give that trait over to its children. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's a buff guy, right? Is as a result of his buffness, is he going to create buff children? As a very, like, just the fact that he's trained it. Now, he might have certain genes predisposed to making him buff. Now, Lamarck believed that you could, that's how giraffes existed. That they, one species of giraffe, like, stretched out just a little bit more, and like stretched their neck just a little bit, and then the child of that, the progeny, had a little bit longer neck, and that one, and they kept doing that until until you could actually,
reach the tree.
very, very slowly you can reach the tree. The great grandchild of the giraffe. So. Huh?
If each one needed to reach the tree to live.
Yeah, well, it was just.
Wait, does that even work? Like just like stretching?
Yeah, and so
Or
even.
if you decide that you're going to be in shape, your kids are still going to be in shape or whatever.
But why? Why would your children be in shape if
Well,
you're
I
in
mean,
shape?
it makes
Sense.
sense. Well, I mean, if you have like a body that's like healthy, I guess like you'll have healthy children, right?
Not necessarily.
You know,
There's their
well,
own-
I mean, like,
Yeah.
Well, you
No,
can be
I
born.
think
like you
it-
pass down traits to your children. Like if
Mhm.
you
Well,
have,
if you don't have, like,
if you have healthy
obesity
like
gene.
organs and stuff like your children, like it's not.
But
guaranteed.
what is it about your healthy organs? Was it because of your own nutrition, or was it because of your?
Well,
your
depends on
genes?
which one it's on.
Well, I think
there's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
I think we can conclude that.
I don't know, like certain families are more predisposed to I like obesity, diabetes.
Right.
Like, certain like genetic.
Yeah, there are
But I don't
genetic
think that
factors.
You can, like.
But that was what Lamarck. That was what I'm saying is I think that's what Lamarck was missing, is the idea of genetic.
Yeah.
The thing that made the giraffes neck longer, assuming that's how the evolutionary branch, I don't know, I'd have to look it up, but assuming that's how the evolutionary branch existed, it would be through genetic drift and gene mutation, not necessarily through stretching out of the neck. That doesn't. But you're right in the sense that if we were to look at it the non-Lamarckian way, the way that we observe it today, it would be that the animals that have sort of survival fittest kind of thing, natural selection, that those external factors, if there's too much vegetation, the people who can get at the higher vegetation can be stronger and therefore survive more. You're saying that the natural sort of genetic health of an individual will be passed down to its children, not only through genes, but also then through nutrition. So if I can eat more, my children are going to be healthier as babies and will survive more likely. So that will pass on. So these are all interesting things. Probably good to look up a little bit about what evolution actually entails if we're not familiar with it. And that's for you guys as well. If you're not familiar with it, something to look up, because it will be something that we no doubt discuss as a point of contention in the debates that we will have next week. Go ahead.
Back to the
Please
big
do.
string thing. I looked it up. The only thing I could find was the big Wikipedia page on it. I couldn't
Okay, that's
find,
fine.
like, any actual sources.
Okay, we'll have to deal with Wikipedia.
But it said recent experimental evidence, namely the observation of distant supernova as standard candles and well-resolved mapping of the cosmic microwave background.
Please write that down because that's very important.
Has led to
Can be tested.
speculation that the expansion of the universe is not being slowed down, but rather is being sped up, and gravity is accelerating it.
Accelerating it.
So it's accelerating, so it's not gonna slow.
Oh, so it's
Because like the
Okay.
theory is that the gravity's eventually gonna
Gonna-
slow it down, so it's just gonna start pulling it back. But it's saying no, gravity's speeding it up.
It's actually pushing it, or whatever we might
Yeah,
use
whatever.
to describe that. Whatever.
Yeah.
Insert complicated scientific description here. Push. Okay. Okay, thank you for that. In case you ever needed to know whether the universe is expanding or
It's okay,
contracting.
guys.
Well, that's good to know. Okay, so that has been debunked. So I'm glad that I'm not giving you guys bad science, which is what we're going to talk about today: pseudoscience and bad science as well. Anything else from that section that was good? Paradigm shifts and Newton. We're not going to have the whole book, unfortunately, described because there's only be 2 sections there. How about science? What's one thing about science so far surprising to you that we've discussed? So we can kind of think about it. Surprising. It's all kind of like fitting, and you're like, yeah, I understand this.
Well,
You know,
I
or
guess
what's something
the
surprising or
thing
interesting
is,
about
like,
science?
The social implications of it.
The social implications, which we will talk about today. Very good. How are the implications from different? Think about like name the social implications of science. Like name something.
Like reputations of it, like rejection, or just portraying the people who are saying it as like how they did with Darwin.
Right.
Or just like the cause of the paradigm shifts that are that occur due to that.
Right. And paradigm is an interesting word in general because we talked about that as being a new way of thinking about the same stuff because of perhaps new observations. But again, it's the same universe. So Newton saw the same universe as Einstein, and yet were able to, through various other discoveries, to maybe see it more clearly. It's something completely different. I showed you that illusion, that picture. Is like, is this an old woman or a young woman turned away? Did you guys ever see those kind of things where you can see it 2 different ways? It's sort of what a paradigm shift is. It's the same stuff. You're just looking at it in a different light. Is that paradigm only scientific, or are paradigms descriptive of the entire social fabric, like what Darwin had to deal with? And then later, how that is dealt with ed policy, which is something we'll look at briefly today as well. Education, how does it impact education? That's the Scope Monkey trial. I mean, that's can we teach evolution in schools? Should we teach it? Is it subversive to morality, education in general, religious, civic responsibilities? Is there some other type of issue? And is there credence to those arguments? Paradigms, like evolutionary biology, did create a social component that has now since been obsolete. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Evolutionary biology creating a social component. You're thinking about survival of the fittest. Social Darwinism, right? So this is an interesting thing. So this is where science kind of has this blip where it's like, oops, we did something that was biological, and then it had this effect that wasn't intended, but it was seen for lots of very smart people, something that was, of course, I mean, people who have mental illness, they should be sterilized. because why would you want mental ill patients to reproduce? That's not how species should advance. And so you can notice how they take something that's biological and give it a social implication and an ethical implication, and try and control the future. We'll also look at that. Science is a predictive mechanism. All right, hello, hey, come on in. Good, thank you. Einstein, did we already talk about Einstein's, like something cool about Einstein?
That was last time.
Oh, that was last week.
We're
Oh,
Darwin.
Darwin, I'm sorry. We already talked about Darwin. Cool, you guys are done. Thank you. You guys, please continue.
Just reading notes?
No, read notes, but answer those questions if you can. How's science different according to your section? Can you give us those facts and then
How is it different from other scenarios?
answer that question?
Hmm.
Let's just start with the facts for a second, and then you can.
I'll just start with facts? Or, okay.
That's right.
Okay, brain's not working today.
Drink more
Okay.
Coke. I know, right? I said drink more Coke. Can't drink that Coke.
Okay. Here, you want to start, Haley? Well,
Be
I'll let you
worthless.
start.
Wasting thousands. No, wait, do it.
There's a lot of different things, and I felt like in our chapter, a lot of things didn't get answered.
Okay.
Like, it just kind of just, like, talked about things and, like, went into, like, this discussion, and then we never got, like, an answer.
Did you finish the section, or did it seem kind of random, the whole
No,
setting
It
system?
was random. It
One
was
of
Yeah.
them
really
was,
random.
one of them was, the heading was theory or observation. Which comes first? They never
And then
answered
they
that.
never answered the question.
Oh,
Right
but
in
we're in
discussion.
TOK. Is there an answer? Is the question, right?
It was just like it like explained both of them, and then like it just went on, and then like it was just like what was the heading for then? Like, why would you put it in the question? Like
Why would you put a question that
Yeah.
doesn't have an answer? Do you remember the beginning of our whole
I know.
year?
it was just really
Questions.
frustrating.
Every question
They could have
leads
given
to
us
more
some
questions.
points, like some.
Oh, to kind of work through it maybe a little
really
more.
work through it, but they didn't. It was just.
Everything was
What
just
comes
random. Kind of.
Well, what do you think comes first, a theory or an observation?
In observation.
Totally
Seems
no,
like-
well, no.
Yeah,
I
they
think
definitely
because
do that.
because it could go either way. Like you could think of something and then like no.
Maybe
Well,
both
because-
can be
I
discovered
mean,
at the
it's
same
not
time.
physically possible to.
Because
but
you could argue that, observations, through observation we form theories, through
Yeah.
observations of things tend to, happen in a pattern and then say, okay, well, it usually happens that way, it's going to be, your theory, but usually, if we have theories, we tend to say that, oh, this is fact, so we make observations based on those theories. We say, well, since we know this
Right.
is true, then I could observe that, and that, like, it,
Mhm.
I don't know, that's why they're asking the question.
Yeah.
Because it could go either way.
Well, let's see if we can work through it. The first thing that I'd say is, who is it when we talk about these theory versus observation? What, or I should say, who are we talking about? Who are we talking about? Do observations just exist randomly, or
The observer.
the observer? There's an observer, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at. It's a simple point, but
So
who is the observer, and what is his background or history? So do we all live in a vacuum of, when we look at the world, we see it through this sort of uneducated, clearly objective way, or is there some sort of development to that stage of observation? Especially scientists. I mean, they go to school, they have peer reviews, they're part of a community that lets us know that they, in fact, can produce something that's repetitive or some other type of thing that perhaps fits in a theory, or if it's a little bit challenging, will go against the theory, but might in fact change the theory in some significant way. So what I'm saying is that scientists, we start with the idea of being a scientist or a person or a knower. At that point, they work already. Do we not all already work within theories in general, and that through observation we can change the theory, but we don't have to be reliant only on the theory. We can constantly. The question is two things. It's the definition of theory, and whether or not the knower is always dogmatically required to be a part of the theory. Is a theory a static thing? Is science a static thing? I don't think so. I think theories are constantly expanding, just like the universe that's relative. I think they can expand to include new information, or drop off parts of the information or a place that's a large puzzle of various people's contributions to it. So really, what is a theory? And that would be, I think that would start getting you on the way to answer that question for yourself, because it might be different for other people. And as a result of that, you have that theory of truth in general. How do we see truth? Does truth only work to correspondence, where I'm only looking at the world based upon what I see versus what I know it to be? Or is there some sort of coherence system or pragmatic system? If this works, then I'm going to go with it. Those are all questions that are involved with the philosophy of science behind the observation or behind the theory. And so various people, we mentioned serendipities, these happy accidents. Those people work out of naivete, meaning they don't know the theory that they're supposed to know, and as a result they might actually change the theory. So the answer to the question of theory or observation is yes.
Yeah.
There you go, how about that? What's the sound of one hand clapping? Duh! Alright. It's both, or neither at the same time, right? Okay, so I'm glad that cleared things up. Alright, anything else? Is that kind of just sort of confused in general?
Well, I don't know, one question they included in here about paradigm shift that was really cool was when Einstein, after I'd forgotten what they changed or figured out, but the quote read, when I realized what this new kind of knowledge meant, it was as if the ground had been pulled out from under me and I had no place left to stand. So it's kind of like if you happen to disprove or change, some sort of knowledge that is, that building block for all these other things, what happens when that's disproven? What happens to the rest of that knowledge?
What happens to all the observations you've constructed on the society, or constructed on the basis of this theory? Do those things disappear, or do you have to reconfigure how you look at it? And we're thinking of it on all this physical way, like these building blocks, which might be explanatory. It might have explanatory power, but is it not? Maybe not so much building blocks, but a network or a web of observations that we then now have to look at from a different. Now that the floor is gone, we have to look at all this stuff from a different. Does that help you? Look at it from like this three-dimensional plane. Sort of like Minority Report, where it's like, looking at it from a different perspective, perhaps, because your floor is different. So the floor is swung around, and now you're seeing it from a different side, but the same observations. Another part of the book that probably didn't get discussed because we don't have anyone here to discuss it with us, unfortunately, in our group here, is the idea, where was it? How does science work? No, where was that at? What do you really observe? Oh, what do you really observe? On page 156. This is an important section. If you didn't read this because it wasn't in your section, I'd kind of look at it again. Look at it yourself for your notes, just for your own benefit, but also as required in your notes. Because I think that section and the what are scientific laws are pretty important. When you look at the world, let's say you're looking at things really, really far away. What are you actually looking at? Well, what are you observing? What is observation at that point? When you're looking at a planetary system that's light years away from us, 250, 300,000, whatever light years. What are you seeing? What are you actually looking at?
Light. Photon.
And are you even looking at the light at that point? Or are you looking at
7-year-old?
Yeah.
7-year-old.
If I'm making like 7-year-old photon, yeah, you're seeing it in the past, number one, which is a weird thing. You guys know that? When you look at the sun, you look at it about 9 minutes in the past because of how long it takes the light to travel.
So there's really no possible way to look at it in the present unless
Unless you were there, and
You wouldn't
even
know if the sun exploded until
Would it be like
long.
immediate?
No, 9 minutes.
Or would we figure out 9 minutes later if the sun just like randomly exploded, or would you see, because obviously like
We
an
wouldn't see it
explosion in the
until 9
sun would
minutes
be
later.
like obvious.
No, it
Would
wouldn't be-
come, like,
it
9
would
minutes
take
later?
9
We wouldn't
minutes
even notice.
That'd be weird.
you wouldn't see the light going until 9 minutes
That's
after.
weird.
Yeah.
Oh.
So we would still have those 9 minutes of perfect life before everything would die. You know what I mean? Like here's the light, and
Saw
it'd be
a
like,
video, and apparently
F you.
100 years or something without the sun. I saw this video and that's really
Oh, we still would have that much time?
because of like
The
heat
convection
and
of our atmosphere?
our atmosphere, our core, and everything. But eventually,
Yeah, we die.
Wait, so that
Wait,
means
how
you-
long?
Well,
You said 9 years?
sun dies, I'm still.
So
Screw
Wait, how many
you,
years
screw
is
you,
that?
grandkids, I'm
Sun
good.
died.
Yeah, what happens if the sun just like
well, not an explosion.
where does it go?
Eventually, well, I mean, it's the same question as
Just like
what if the sun were around for 100,000 years? Eventually, we would die.
Yeah.
The whole heat death of the universe is a fun thing to think about.
That would give us enough time to create
Another
something.
sun.
No, not
A pod to leave.
Yes,
another
something to
sun.
leave.
Yeah, quick, get on, everyone's North Korea, let's go, let's get some nukes going. let's reignite the sun.
Oh my gosh.
That'd make a good
In time of
movie.
need, I think we'd probably be able to do something crazy.
They had a movie called, or was it Into the Earth's Core or something like that?
I
A nuclear bomb to like reignite the Earth's core. I'm sure that's really scientifically accurate, especially because it has Ben Affleck in it, right? No, wait, does that have Ben? No, that didn't have Ben. That had that
Wait, I
other
was in
lady.
like 6th grade. Like,
Yeah.
Journey to the center.
Journey to the, yeah, whatever.
yeah, that
Um,
too.
That's an
makes
interesting,
sense.
that's all science fiction from the future, or from the past is all that.
I was like,
Did you know that the Earth is hollow, and so if you went inside it'd be an ocean, and you walk on the shell of the planet, because centrifugal force would keep you. That's great. Great physics there.
And then I mean like a journey to the center to like no go to the center. We have
What we
flies.
would-
Going to the center,
Yeah.
going to the center.
You know,
They're still like,
flies.
that movie is so stupid. What do we really observe when we look at things far away? Not only do we look at the past, but we might be looking at like a piece of paper that has a wave, and we're like measuring the waves or some sort of equations. Or when you look at other things, when you measure electrons, you might be seeing just bleeps on it, some sort of computer system, or looking at calculations from a computer. Do we actually observe it in the same direct way that we might observe this chair? And so there's this really interesting critical view of how science observes the world right on page 157 that feeds into the debate of science versus religion. It's not from someone who's obviously religious, it's someone who's maybe critical of the deterministic view of science, which might lend itself to openings in the views of other areas of knowing, I should say, like history, like you talked about. But it talks about, when we look at the world in this sort of complex way, are we actually seeing it, or are we seeing things on a piece of paper, or ratios, or curves, or some sort of mathematical way of knowing? And as such, when we think of things as being direct, are we actually seeing it, or are we seeing the photoelectrons and da-da-da-da-da, all the things that are going into our brain that cause our brain to have stimuli that might create a long chain of what he calls inferences and assumptions of how the world actually is. And we've been talking about this, the idea of sense perceptions themselves being not trustworthy to this perfect certitude. But obviously with science and with everything, we're assuming that we can know things to a certain degree, but not to a perfect degree. Can we maybe agree on that? Perhaps. Okay. Then we're not going to see things perfectly. Good. Anything else that you'd like to talk about in your section that we need to know?
Well, they also talked about, see, there was how he showed an explanation is really scientific, then also the creationism versus evolution was covered, and then also induction.
Induction.
Is there a scientific
Oh, okay, so inductive reasoning versus...
Yeah, like an inductive reasoning, like how much can we depend on it,
Yeah.
really? So,
By the way, I confused those, I think, last time. Inductive is when you go from a small to big, and deductive is when you go big to small. So I'm so sorry that I did that. I was thinking about, I was like redefining it in my head, I'm like,
You have to rethink everything.
I know, I paradigm shift of ignorance
So
from your
inductive
teacher.
is small to big.
Inductive is small to
Wait,
big.
that doesn't.
I know,
Wait,
yes.
No, inductive reasoning and
So,
math. We did
Sherlock
inductive
Holmes
proofs,
wasn't
and that's
inductive.
actually.
Maybe I'm wrong
Wait.
again.
Okay.
Look it up, double check it. Yeah,
Look it up.
I'm pretty sure oh my god, this is gonna sound embarrassing to the groups looking at Mr. Morris is an idiot.
My space bar.
Deductive goes from general theories to deduce a conclusion, whereas inductive is to go from small things to big.
Yeah. Oh.
Is that correct?
I hope so.
Do you know, or?
No, I don't know.
Okay, so I'm just listening. I thought I looked that up and double checked it, that's in fact what Sherlock
Is it
Holmes
inductive? Go ahead.
Generalizations, reasoning from detailed facts to general principles. So we have
Detailed facts to
Yeah.
general principles is inductive, and that's what I got confused because it does sound like deduction
Yeah.
should be, because we hear Sherlock Holmes as a deductive reasoner, and he's not. He's an inductive reasoner, and that's a problem of the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, not knowing the philosophical differences. It sounds like it's a deduction, deductive logic, but it's actually not. Copernicus, why was he interesting and unique?
Well, because he was the first to, he was one of the first to argue that we didn't have a geocentric model of the solar system, we had a heliocentric.
Yeah, and so anything regarding maybe a TOK question, did you guys do one of those or not? No, that's all right. Let me offer one
I didn't even
because
see that there.
because why would I have chosen Einstein and Copernicus specifically for this section? What are some commonalities, I should say, between these two characters?
Space.
They both exist in space. They both are made of matter.
They both talk about
Huge shifts in
instances
the way we view
space.
science.
Like Copernicus had the heliocentric view,
The heliocentric model.
and then Einstein with theory of relativity. Is it?
Uh,
And
oh, I mean, I'm sorry, this shouldn't have been Einstein, it should have been Darwin.
Oh.
That's why I'm screwing you guys up. This should be Darwin, I apologize.
Both of them,
Yeah.
both of them were attacked, like both theories. I know with
Yes.
Copernicus, he didn't
Sorry.
even publish like his
You're right,
work
too.
until like right before he died, because he was afraid that he was going to be persecuted by the Catholic Church at that time. Because it was, they said that there was a geocentric model, and they would, anyone who would challenge that was declared, a heretic.
Yeah.
So, Copernicus, other scientists at that time, that was, their thing, like they were afraid to publish their views.
Right, and it was assumed that you couldn't have a biblical worldview without a geocentric worldview. So it was a great example of the time that the Bible made it clear as a way of knowing, an authoritative way of knowing, a revealed Word of God type knowing, that if you had a heliocentric model, you would be removing humanity from the center of this creation. Now, is that necessary to anyone today for their religious faith? And yet they still have, a lot of people have deep religious faith, and yet they completely synthesize heliocentricity because of its overwhelming proof with their religion. Why? How? Is that possible? Is religion always just a constant false thing, or is it that it can still have explanatory power, just like science can have explanatory power in the midst of change or paradigm shifts, right? So that's the question I think that's that we would have presented to us on Wednesday between science and religion. Is it that they share more in common than perhaps we give credence to them? Is there language that we can use to interact? I think Copernicus and Darwin are great examples too, because individually Copernicus retained his faith and didn't see anything issued with it, whereas Darwin didn't. Darwin had this, it seemed clear to him that he couldn't make it compatible. And is evolution at some level completely incompatible with religious knowing, or is it only to Darwin's view and those of, I guess, a lot of scientists today in the current paradigm? Yes?
Well, also with Copernicus, it was interesting because he was religious, and he
Yeah.
wanted to dedicate his work to the Pope at that time. He wanted to acknowledge that this is it was like a matter of respect, but at that time the church didn't accept that.
And that is
so.
And that is the major argument, I think, of Ian Hutchinson. With Science Refutes God. How can science refute God when science itself developed in a religious context? It seemed to be that people understood the basic assumptions and laws of the universe, maybe incorrectly so in some regards, like Newton's idea of solid particles and the laws of nature that are sort of unchangeable because of God. But do we all look at Newton and go, what an idiot? Like, no, unless you're a real snobby person standing on their shoulders and spitting on them from underneath you. Because their theories, even though they were based in part on a religious worldview, still have explanatory power, certainly an influence in how science operates. And that's what Ian Hutchinson would defend today, that religious people and science can be sort of compatible. But we will explore that more. I don't want to just give it away completely, because I think there are steps we can take to understand this. I had simple tasks for you, which we will unfortunately have to get into next week. This one took long, but I don't know why, but it was good. It was a good conversation. Research a moment of science serendipity and a definition of science. We still are trying to work through those quotes that I gave you. Hopefully you have a definition. We will talk about that on Wednesday.
Is this it?
Huh?
This
That's not it. That's going to be a scenario we're going to do right now in 5 minutes.
You're cheating.
I know you ruined it. You destroyed it because you looked at it. Okay, so in these 5 minutes, I want you to look at your scenario. There's 4 scenarios, and I thought there would be, more teams, but now each of you get your own scenario. So, except for Kyle, he can look at one of theirs. To look at your scenario, I want you to consider that dilemma because we're going to be talking about in community. How does science apply? We've mentioned that as a key phrase of your notes. How does it apply to history? How are there paradigm shifts? If you worked in a worldview today in which that paradigm shift had yet to be affected, how are you going to, from a scientific perspective, affect that change in that population? And is it possible? Is it impossible to go about these complex problems without utilizing other areas of knowledge? So go read yours in a couple minutes, and then just start sharing out your section, what your section's about, and what you would do to offer a solution, if there is one. Some of them are pretty awful. So some of them are more, I don't know, just more contentious in general.
Are the quotes on volunteers even forced to volunteer?
Volunteer. I can't remember what that context is for that. I have to reread it. I think it's like a cheeky thing. They are volunteered, to do it. What do we have? Someone want to share out their scenario? Go for it. What's your scenario?
Well, it's not because I like this. It's just I like reading about sicknesses, injuries, parasites, and those things.
Oh, okay.
It's about hookworms. They're pretty much these parasites that they can be found in water that isn't exactly sanitary. They can cause intense pain as the worm slowly makes its way out of the body through the skin, causing open wounds and permanent scars, and they can kill. Especially children. In some cultures, they consider water holy because that's where they feel that their ancestors dwell after death. But this whole thing is, do we have a right to blame the water? Because this would be blaming their entire heritage, and also how do we approach this? I don't really feel that you should blame the water. I believe you should blame what's in the water.
Yeah.
And there are ways of purifying, water.
There you go. Okay, so using a language, changing the language a little bit.
To purify your holy water.
But the water is dirty because of our ancestors. I mean, that would be
it's just because
the
I mean,
corollary.
yeah, it's like
they're trying to
you-
kill you.
Yeah.
You gotta save your ancestors.
There you go. These are.
You gotta save your ancestors.
So what do you do from a scientific perspective? How do you convince these people who don't understand the paradigm that you're working under? What can you do?
Well, you can show them what's in the water and be like, okay, look, we're gonna look
Oh, that's simple,
at
right?
this water underneath the microscope.
Look, it's
look at
bugs. They're
You're like,
eggs.
yeah, you just,
Let's
you
get
know,
them
be
out.
like, this is gross. You should, purify your holy
Yeah.
water.
Also,
To-
yeah.
You cleanse it. Cleanse the water, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Right. What other things could you do as far as in the way of analogy that would kind of help them understand, educate in the realm of science on that? Is their water source not having other creatures in it that they can actually observe or have maybe been part of that their own worldview? So is there fish in the water? So I'd kind of start with that.
Yeah.
Look at your fish. Look, you have fish in the water. This is a type of thing like a fish. It's an animal
Yeah.
that's just in the water, but it's just doing bad things to you. So let's just take it out, just like you could catch a fish, right? You can do something with the water. This is actually a problem that is affecting millions of people around these developing countries, and it's almost obliterated
Did
through
they
a
give them straws that they could use?
straws. Do they have straws? Interesting.
No, I think they
You
gave
looked
them
at-
straws that they
Straws.
that filtered the water.
Oh right, yeah, they have straws, and they also just do like fabrics. Like I know this was Jimmy Carter's big thing is sort of these fabrics that you could do to purify the water. So this is an example. Each one of these is a real example, by the way, of a problem of science that is then applied into various places. So interesting. Keep thinking about your section. Let's do. Oh, we got no more. Okay. The rest, you guys all want to talk about it for a couple more minutes, or do you want to do this next week? What do you think?
I don't.
You have a doctor's appointment. Okay, go ahead and go. Do you guys want to do it for a couple more minutes? Okay. Read your section. Haley, have your section. Be thinking about it. Wednesday, you're going to be
Okay,
sharing.
so
Okay.
I am a German scientist who's studying hyperthermia on the human body, and I am conscripted by the Luftwaffe, which I'm guessing is like government.
It's a science community.
Okay.
Oh, weren't they a part of the Nazis?
Ah, that's
That German language tipped it off.
To complete trials on human volunteers
There you go.
that include enduring ice water for up to 5 hours at 5 degrees Celsius, as well as standing naked outside
Yeah.
with temperatures below -6 degrees Celsius.
Mhm.
So the potential benefits is that it could save future soldiers' life on the Eastern Front, and make us understand hyperthermia in a greater way to prevent it in the future. So how do I approach this dilemma of saving the volunteers because they're gonna die?
Yeah. What do you think?
Do they really volunteer? Or?
No,
It's
what we're talking about is a
implications.
pool of people that are being forced.
Yeah, I was thinking.
So
volunteer
does
for
science have some sort of language to
So am I
discuss
trying to
this from that perspective? What is the perspective? I mean, what I want to
So, wait, am I trying to convince the Luftwaffe that this is not good?
Yeah, like how do you or in your own personal view of that, if you're being conscripted to do this, how do you approach this? Thought. There's a lot of different angles with it, so I just want you to kind of run with it.
If it was me and it was I have these like moral things in my mind,
Yeah.
I would probably do bad science and say that I did it with them, or
Okay.
like be like, I have a new way. Just like let's take a part of your skin, put it in some water, and just stir it up, and analyze it after, and then say, oh okay. Just
Okay.
write something random, be like, okay, here's the.
So sometimes it's okay to do bad science if there's an ethical issue involved.
I think it's better than.
I think it's better than doing something that's quantitative to what.
Because I don't really see any other.
You could
So
tell
there's-
them. You could tell them that the human volunteers are not actual soldiers, so they won't respond the same.
They're not actual soldiers. You better go get some more Nazis. for
Like an
us.
actual Nazis.
Yeah.
Nazi soldiers.
Okay. Now,
There's no way to decide this. You have to go through it.
well, that's the question. Is there always a way to quote unquote opt out? Yes. But you might find yourself one of the volunteers. If you know, so you know what I mean, like that. Especially if they find out you're doing bad science,
Yeah.
that might be a problem as well. So,
Yeah.
how is all this possible? You guys ever watch Schindler's List?
Yeah.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that? Where he's saying like, I need more children. You know, look at these hands. You know, perfect. The real reason is he's just saving them, literally saving. So is there a way to do that? This is an interesting dilemma for a lot of reasons that are more complex than what we see here, because it is that, you know, should I be so protesting that I die, I get killed for this belief, or
Not even another.
or can I help them in some subversive way, and is this a good function? Remember, Germans have a really interesting ethic in general that kind of undermines a lot of this question, because they didn't think of ethics in the same way that we do today. There was very much one of my German professors in college talked about, even today, it's not about things being good or bad. So here's this, it's what you think? Not good or bad, but right and wrong. This is the right way, this is the wrong way. So you have people who, this is right. It's not that it's good, it's right. Meaning this is the way that, it's an authoritarian way of looking at things. It's etiquette. This is how Germans be. So that was his description of that. It's very interesting because I think it explains a lot about what happened to the. Did you guys ever watch The Reader? That movie that had Kate Winslet in it. She's on trial, and she's found out years later when they start trying people. Kate Winslet's character is a nurse who's part of the Nazi party, and she's doing something because it was right. It was her orders, which was to lock a door as Jews were being burned inside the building on purpose. But she didn't realize why she was going to go to jail for the rest of her life for it after they begin this trial process in the 1950s for what she did because she was ordered to do it. It just was right. That's what you do. She didn't think about the implications of what she's doing. So hypothermia, and then the greater question, this was go back to our consequentialist versus deontological, is we know a lot about hypothermia because of what happened in the Luftwaffe. So we know stuff about how to, like, we have techniques that Nazis had developed. Should we use that knowledge? Or
Yes.
now that we have it, well, if it happened,
Well, if they had
turn a blind eye to it.
Yeah, they might as well make their death meaningful.
And that's might be how we describe it in a new paradigm as well. We might as well. But can that be exploited?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think we should continue that research.
Yeah.
Oh.
It should be established like everywhere.
That you
That's
do
not-
that sort of thing, but should we use the information that's developed? Is it admissible in the scientific
Yes.
arena, or is it like a courtroom where we don't admit things that are unconstitutional? That's not how science is a little bit more pragmatic than that, or something, right? It reminds me of that scene in The Holy Grail, which he's like, it's the father of the male princess who falls, and he's like, my son dies, because he like pushed him off. He's like, and after a tragic death, I'm still it's the father-in-law. That's who it is. The tragic death of the father-in-law. I'm still alive. He's like, the near fatal wounding. I'm getting better. Just when he thought he was getting better, the cold stab of death is upon him. But now that he's off, I don't think that I've lost a son, but more gained a daughter. So like everything kind of works in his system because he can like get it to work and then go, oh, but we might as well remember the legacy of these people. So that might be what we do with hypothermia. I don't know, like turn a blind eye to the process and still use the application. But you're right, legacy of those people, bravely volunteering. Oh my God. Yeah, fun. What was your section?
Okay, so I'm an 8th grade biology teacher
Yep.
in the U.S. and I teach so half of my students are what are called young Earth creationists.
Yeah, you're sort of in a
They-
demographic that would be.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so I'm nearing the section of where I teach biological evolution, and it says speciation through random mutation and selectivity. And I have to figure out a way to teach the students without destroying their faith.
Or is it possible? Like
Yeah,
that's
it is
sort of the question. Is it
possible.
possible? Is it possible, or is there a way that you approach it that doesn't necessarily destroy, or is this going to be incompatible at some level? What do you think?
It was kind of hard for me to think about this one because I think as long as you teach them the scientific aspects of it, it wouldn't really ruin their faith because their faith is based on, I would say maybe more moral
Okay.
than actual fact. And so since science is fact and this is fact, you're just teaching it, you're not really saying that you believe in it, you're not really teaching them to believe in it, you're just teaching the students. So I think you could.
So your philosophy, your take on education would then be that kind of here's the what?
Yeah, at least for that
What is the
section.
thing that you're teaching? Is it hey, is it evidence? Here's the facts. Would you just call
Yeah.
it facts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here are the facts.
Yeah.
Here's a different viewpoint.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe
Here's-
massaging
here's-
it.
It's
What do you think?
not really like I don't think that they're completely incompatible. Like
Would you tell the students that? Like, would you say hey, just let you know, these aren't incompatible? Is it that it's not incompatible?
like because
Young Earth creationism and
You can say whatever you
biological
believe
evolution.
in. Creative.
I think
Create,
I think what you
like
should
whatever
do is
you
try
believe in, maybe you could push it that way, or you could just leave it up to interpretation, which I think
Yeah.
is the best thing to do.
Yeah.
But you
You
shouldn't be
shouldn't
oblivious to
interpretation.
like what we know. Everyone
I
should
know,
have the
I
right
mean,
to know.
I know that I always go back to you know there's so many things that are left out of the big picture, and how do we really know where that came from. Those huge, holes in, these theories. How can we explain those? And, there's always room for people to interpret things differently, I feel. So I do feel like they're compatible. Like, I don't feel that, like, if we're talking about evolution, I don't feel that it provides, that core, this is where it all started here. I believe that it explains how species adapted to their environments. I don't think that it...
Are you speaking of yourself, or are you speaking as the teacher, just to
Just like
clarify?
as the teacher?
Are you, because it sounds like you're speaking for yourself, which
Yeah.
is great. I'm just wondering if it's,
Like, as a teacher...
and let's say you're the teacher to the
As a
group,
teacher,
would you
you want to
continue
leave
to
it
do?
open to interpretation, because
Okay.
you want to, like, especially in today's society, you want to leave everything politically correct.
Okay,
You
so you're trying to,
don't want to say, you don't want to offend people, you don't want to, I don't know, I feel like that's the way that I was taught. Like, you're given, this information, but you're not,
So how do you teach then the question is, can you teach, let's say, let's not make it young Earth creationism. Let's say it's someone who is a Hindu who believes that Shiva as Nataraja is the one who is in charge of creating the universe in that sort of way. And it was done very clearly in it was done to the point where everything is as it is. And so there seems to be, at that point, a clear sort of
like that.
incompatibility with how we observe
I
evolution.
feel like it would be unfair to not tell them. So
Okay.
I feel like everyone, it shouldn't be.
What do you mean
up to
unfair?
Okay, it
Go ahead.
shouldn't be that you're trying to be politically correct. I think it should be more like the fairness aspect. Everyone should.
What's
have,
fair?
What's fair is that everyone should have their just the separate plates of everything, like their belief, other beliefs, and then science should also be a belief. Like you
Okay.
should whatever you
You should
study everything, and then you just come up with your either putting them all
How
together.
the
or
You
senses
just
should be given
which
the
one-
entire, not just from one perspective, but everything, so
They
you
should know all
can,
this
you can
perspective.
determine what you feel is
So
right.
you start not with the idea that you're going to somehow disprove some other aspect of knowing, so much so as clarifying an aspect of that knowing, or clarifying an aspect of it as in a scientific knowing, perhaps. And fairness, I think, is an interesting word, because you're talking about your obligation, perhaps, not only to your subject, because you do have an obligation, there's a history of evolution, but also to maybe civic awareness. Is it important for me let's say I'm a Christian and I'm a young Earth creationist, do I have an obligation to know about Shiva as Nataraja as well as I do about macroevolutionary processes? Do we decide that this is important for everyone to
It's
know?
not an obligation, but rather a right.
A right? Okay, so maybe not
To know, sort of just like,
but is that what
You
is that what school is? Is school all about just rights, or is it about obligations? Do we not have
Well,
From a
maybe-
school perspective, I feel like it should be taught still, just normally, like how Eric said, just presented.
presented sort of in a sort of a
and maybe school presents
And is that
you
possible?
with information curriculum stuff that,
Don't use
everybody
emotion.
feels that you
Right.
should be introduced to, and then you can interpret.
So in my science book, is there equal obligation in that regard to teach Genesis, Shiva,
Well,
Darwin?
not
It
in,
doesn't have,
or are we talking about things that aren't necessarily scientific?
well, that would be not from scientific lens. If we're talking about specifically religious teachings, if we're talking just about those, that would be more, you could learn about that in a social studies history class,
Well,
you'll learn about
okay.
that in a religious studies class. That wouldn't be something that you're learning about in science. Science, you're learning more about scientific branches of knowledge, not,
Yeah.
not,
Okay, that's all I was just wanting to
Yeah.
think about that. Do you feel like, because that is one of the debates, I don't know if you're familiar with this, should we at some level have textbooks that reflect the debate as opposed to the theories that science produces within the auspices of science? The debate meaning that we somehow think of evolution, and then we're also, as a scientist, obligated to teach these other aspects of religious knowing, or should we leave those things as from different perspectives
So
and from
it's
different
sort of like
worldviews?
the argument of what class do we put that in?
Yeah, well, what class do we
Or-
put these guys? Or is there something lacking in our scientific, or in our education system about science that it might need to be addressed? is this question of evolution should it even exist in a biology classroom? That might be something to think about as well. Is it part of biology? I'm saying it
Evolution
rhetorically, but I
can
think
help you, like, if you wanted to become a scientist, a biologist, then you would need
a
to
doctor.
know evolution. Yeah, a doctor.
yeah,
You
you're gonna
need
need to
to
know
know
the
basic
fundamental
basics,
aspects
yeah.
of evolution, right? So there's
So
a
it helps
reason.
you in your life.
Let's go ahead and stop there because this will have to continue, and I apologize for going over. Oh yeah, we went over too much there. I apologize for that. We will continue this, and we'll continue our discussions of this Wednesday. So make sure you're here. We will continue with these ethical questions and pseudosciences, things that maybe, despite our religious beliefs, we can agree maybe that Bigfoot isn't the most noteworthy pursuits, but then again, maybe cryptozoology is a new paradigm that will happen sometime in the future. So I don't know. Thanks for your attention.